I'd like to welcome Paulo Di Gregorio back to the Senior Center. He's going to talk about John and Abigail, a love story on Valentine's Day. Thank you, Paulo.
Thanks. How's everybody doing today? Happy Valentine's Day. Also, happy Ash Wednesday. I wish I'd remembered that before I had that pepperoni pizza, but that's neither here nor there. So Valentine's Day is a day when we dress in pink and red, like this side of the room, not you guys, and think about things of love. Thoughts of love can mean that spring is not too far away also, right? Yesterday, pitchers and catchers reported, just kind of as an aside. So Valentine's Day, a time of love. And, it's nice to tell a love story on Valentine's Day. So I decided to reintroduce us to one of America's first great love stories, John and Abigail, the Adamses. Now, while I was putting this presentation together, it occurred to me that their relationship was really more than a love story. Love stories tend to have tragic endings, don't they? Romeo and Juliet, there's always somebody dying young and that sort of thing. Their relationship was very much a partnership of equals. Now, when we think about 18th century New England, the fact that there was this relationship between John and Abigail and that they viewed each other as emotional and intellectual equals is really that much more remarkable. So we're going to delve in a little bit into that relationship to talk about their lives together, their lives apart. One of the themes of their marriage is that they did spend lots and lots of time apart. Part of the occupational hazards of John's profession. So we'll talk about the relationship between John and Abigail and the story going forward. Well, where does the story begin? At the beginning. John Adams was born in Braintree, Massachusetts, today that's Quincy, on October 30th, 1735 in this house. A relatively humble, typical New England salt box house. Has anybody been there? If you haven't been to the Adams National Historical Park, it is well worth the trip. It's 20 minutes away, depending on traffic, 4 hours away, depending on traffic. And it's really a fascinating place to visit because it tells a story of 4 generations of a really important American family. 2 presidents were born within a few feet of each other here in Quincy. So it's a fascinating place to go. You hear the stories, you meet some interesting characters when you visit. In any case, John Adams, born in this relatively humble house in 1735. John's father was a very important member of the community in Braintree. He was a deacon in the local church, and he was a selectman. He was very much involved in government. And oftentimes, there would be important meetings held in the kitchen of the house, this back part over here. And young John, not Deacon John, but young John, would often hear public business being conducted, church business, selectman business. He became very, very interested in politics and in current events. His parents encouraged him to read newspapers, to be up to date on happenings in the local community and really in the bigger world. John's upbringing generated or gave him a lot of intellectual curiosity. He always had a book at hand, was always reading, always thinking, always writing. One of the remarkable things about the Adamses is the volume of writings that they left us. If you go over to the Mass Historical Society in Boston, there are thousands and thousands of letters written by the Adamses, by John, by Abigail, by John Quincy. They wrote constantly and recorded everything. So they leave an incredible record of their lives, their relationships. So John Adams is born here. Very early on, it's decided that, like many other well-to-do young men in Massachusetts, he should go to study. He is earmarked by his parents to go and study for the ministry. They wanted him to become a minister. And in Massachusetts in the 18th century, where did you go if you wanted to study to be a minister? Harvard. You went to Harvard. Well, John went to Harvard, but had no interest in the ministry. He was much more excited and intellectually stimulated by the law. So he went to study law. He's admitted to Harvard when he is 15 years old and finishes his course of studies in about 2 years. He graduates from Harvard and gets a teaching position out in Worcester. So he spends a few years out in Worcester before apprenticing himself to a local lawyer here in Braintree, where he learns the legal profession. So he's very well traveled in this part of Massachusetts, educated at Harvard, educated at home by his parents, very well read, really intellectually curious. In a neighboring town, in Weymouth, in 1744, a young girl named Abigail Smith is born. This is Abigail's birth house. Her father was a Puritan minister and a distant cousin of John Adams. Well, John eventually begins to spend a lot of time here at the Reverend Smith's house. He goes there because the Smiths had one of the best libraries in the local area. Now, at that time, there were no such things as public libraries. You couldn't go down the road with your library card and check out a book or a movie or any of that stuff. Libraries were generally private collections held in people's homes. And if you had a good library, you tended to let people use your books to read, to spread knowledge. So John was intellectually curious, studying law, starts paying visits to his distant cousin here in Weymouth to use the library. And while he is there, he sees his cousin's daughter, Abigail. And he's like, great, Abigail, it's nice. But he soon begins talking to her, and he finds that she is very precocious. She is very well read and very intelligent. In fact, she is unlike any other girl that John had ever met. She was smart and educated and could quote the classics, and really begins to impress John with her knowledge and with her ability to kind of wittily commune with him, talking back and forth very rapidly, jokes and classical references and all that stuff. John becomes very, very impressed and soon becomes very, very infatuated with Abigail. And soon there is a courtship that emerges. Now, John was a relatively insignificant figure in the community. He was a bumpkin country lawyer, and she was the daughter of a prominent minister. It seemed like kind of an odd economic match, but they were a perfect fit for one another. During the course of their courtship in 1763, 64, 65, they are writing letters back and forth, and they are calling each other. He calls her Diana, the Roman goddess of the hunt, and she refers to him as Lysander, a romantic figure from classical mythology. They are exchanging these letters, calling each other these sweet names, kind of having hints of emotional tension there, a little bit of flirtation in the letters. Oh, how I've missed you. Why haven't you written to me today? That sort of thing, back and forth. So there is this budding relationship between these two young people. Now, John is 9 years older than Abigail. So he was at the stage of life where he was looking to get married. Abigail, she is 18, 19. That time, you're about to get married then too. So they find each other and they realize that they are very, very compatible. So, in October of 1764, John and Abigail get married. They are married at her parents' house. Her father conducts the ceremony. So, they get married in October, and then they go off to their own house. Now, as it happens, John had a house already prepared. His father, Deacon John, had purchased a neighboring house, this one here. So there's the house John was born in. Deacon John purchases a piece of property over here, the house, about 75 acres of land. When Deacon John dies, the property goes to John. And he decides that's where I'm going to set up my home. He brings his new bride to the house here in Braintree. Still Braintree at that time. It doesn't become Quincy until 1790 or thereabouts. So it's here where John begins his life as where John and Abigail begin their lives as a married couple. John's younger brother is living in the old family house right there about 75 feet away. So John and Abigail settle into domestic bliss here in their new house. Now, one of the things that John did before moving into the house, before bringing his new bride into this house, was he wanted to modernize it a little bit for her. He wanted to give her the latest innovations. So he redoes the kitchen. He installs, or has installed, a brand new hearth with a big fireplace and a beehive oven built right in. The beehive oven was important. That's where you baked bread and pies and that sort of thing. How many of you have seen a beehive oven? It looks like a beehive. It has a door that you put in front of it to keep the heat in. Traditionally, those beehive ovens were often located at the back of the hearth. So if you were sticking things in there, you had to reach across the open fire. That's very dangerous if you're wearing a big, long dress, right? Because what happens? You catch fire. John didn't want that happening, so he installed the beehive to the side as a convenience for his wife, or soon-to-be wife. In any case, they get married, they move into the house over here in Braintree. And inevitably, what happens? First comes love, then comes marriage. Then they had a growing family. The first child born to John and Abigail was a girl. They named her Abigail. She was born in 1765. Let's see, they're married in late 1764. About 8.5 months later, Abigail is born. Her nickname was Nabby. We're talking really close here on the timeline. But in any case, Nabby is the first child born, a daughter. 2 years later, she is followed by a son who is named John Quincy. John after his father and his father's father, Quincy after his mother's relatives. A second daughter is born in 1768, Susanna. She dies young as a 3-year-old. Then another son, Charles, in 1770. And finally, a third son, Thomas Boylston, in 1772. Now, of John and Abigail's 5 children, only 2 would survive their parents. So they buried 3 of their children. Yet they did have a relatively fruitful marriage in terms of the number of kids they had. Now, when John and Abigail begin their relationship, when they get married, it is a very tumultuous time in American history. There are a lot of things happening. And Boston happens to be an epicenter of much of this turmoil, of much of this excitement. It's during this period that the seeds of the American Revolution are sown. The relationship between the American colonists and the British Crown, British Parliament, begins to deteriorate over the course of the 1760s. And here in Massachusetts, in Boston, there was a lot of turmoil. There were riots. There was violence. There were threats to kill the tax collectors of the hated stamp tax, the Stamp Act over here. There was all sorts of tumultuous activity. And you have a young John Adams, newly married, looking to establish his name, looking to establish his legal practice, getting sucked into a lot of this revolutionary activity. Now, as a lawyer, John's career, his economic success, depended on having lots of clients. You needed clients in order to maintain your business. Well, he has a law office in Braintree. He turns the front room of that house he moved into his law office. He builds a door on the side of it. Let me go back over here as a door that his clients could use so that local farmers could come and seek legal advice from him at any time without disturbing the rest of the family by using the main door over there. That becomes his law office here in Braintree. But he also sets up an office in Boston. And he often spends a lot of time in Boston. After all, there's a lot of activity going on in Boston. It was a major seaport. Lots of people needed representation. And you had all of this revolutionary stuff going on. Now, the American Revolution, the disagreement between the colonists and the crown, essentially begins because of a disagreement over taxes. Britain wanted to tax the colonies. The colonies didn't want to be taxed by Britain. It's kind of a simplified version of what happened. But in essence, it was a tax revolt. You have this taxation that the colonists resented. And soon enough, that taxation and that resent turned to violence. And we begin to see outbreaks of violence in the colonies. Most notoriously, in 1770, there was the Boston Massacre. What happens in the Boston Massacre? Who knows the story of the Boston Massacre? Shots were fired into the crowd.
Really a big deal, but they made it.
It was, I guess in terms of modern day massacres, it wasn't in terms that big of a deal. The reason why it was shocking, and the reason why it comes to be called the Bloody Massacre, as Paul Revere calls it, was because you had British troops firing into a crowd of British colonists. Now, the story we have, the image we have, is often this one here, where you see the troops nice and orderly firing into a peaceful crowd of colonists. I don't know if you can make it out, but you know they're peaceful because they have their pet dog right here in the foreground. Nothing can go wrong when you have your pet dog. The reality of it was much more complex. The crowd wasn't peaceful. They were taunting the British sentries guarding the State House. They were throwing snowballs and rocks and threatening them with clubs and sticks. The British soldiers, 18, 19, 20 years old, thousands of miles away from home, were nervous. They call for backup. More troops come out of the State House. Now you have more nervous young men far away from home with this angry crowd growing more and more agitated. Somebody fires into the crowd. A couple of the other soldiers fire into the crowd. You have 3, 4, 5 people that are killed in this Boston Massacre. It was a shocking moment in the relations between colony and crown. But it also was an opportunity for John Adams. Those soldiers that had fired into the crowd, that had killed somewhat innocent Boston civilians, were going to be put on trial. What do you need if you're put on trial? You need a lawyer. You need somebody to represent you. Well, here's a problem. Who's going to be dumb enough to take the case of the soldiers accused of murder in Boston? Who would dare do that? Well, John Adams rose to the occasion, not because he was dumb, but because he was very principled. He believed that he had the duty to defend those soldiers. Why? Because we are not a society of men, but a society of laws. Law is what holds society together. Law is what gives society structure. And if the law is shirked, if the duty is not fulfilled, society collapses. So he stands up to represent the soldiers here at the Boston Massacre trial. Now, he does this at great risk, great personal risk to himself and to his career. What's he doing? He's defending the British who had perpetrated this murder. Yet he realized that it needed to be done. And people in Boston, in Massachusetts, realized that Adams was very principled and that he was certainly a patriot. He had a long history of siding with the colonies against the crown. So when he took this risk, when he stood up for the soldiers, rather than dooming his career, it actually accelerated it. He became more renowned, more known for his principle, more known for his legal mind. And in fact, his defense of the soldiers was so brilliant that only 2 of them were convicted. And they were convicted of manslaughter, not of murder. Their hands were branded and they were sent back to England. All the other soldiers were acquitted. Adams makes his reputation as a fantastic legal mind here at the Boston Massacre trial. Now, while this is going on, while he's involved in this trial of these soldiers, he's in Boston. Abigail is in Braintree. Occasionally she comes to Boston, occasionally he goes to Braintree. They're still writing letters back and forth, discussing events, talking about what's happening. He's talking about the trial, she's talking about things on the farm. They are keeping each other informed and expressing their emotions through these letters. So the relationship becomes very, very strong, very solid, and they trusted each other implicitly. She was his most trusted advisor, and he was her most trusted friend. Their relationship was built on this very solid foundation. Well, the relationship between Britain and the colonies continues to go bad. In 1772, you have the Gaspé incident, which occurs down in Rhode Island. American patriots out of Providence destroy a British revenue cutter. They're attacking crown property. Things are getting bad. And it really starts to come to a head in 1773, December of 1773, when the Boston Tea Party occurs. The Boston Tea Party, well, we know the story, right? A bunch of patriots disguise themselves as Native Americans, climb onto the 3 ships carrying East India tea and dump the tea into the harbor. Well, the rest of Boston stood on the docks and cheered, apparently. That act of defiance, that act of resistance, and really that act of vandalism, angered Britain, angered the Parliament, angered the Crown. And they decided to pay Boston back. They decided to punish Boston by closing the harbor, dissolving the colonial legislature, bringing in new officials to regulate Boston and to control what was happening in Boston. They passed a series of laws called the Coercive Acts. In the colonies, they called them the Intolerable Acts, which essentially clamped down on the colonial independence of Massachusetts. Here's a cartoon kind of depicting that image, that idea of the Intolerable Acts. You have a British person forcing tea down the throat of a prostrate America, while this guy over here is looking up her skirt, and other people in the background are kind of laughing, except for Liberty over here, which is looking away ashamed. So you have that kind of scenario going on in Boston. Adams was in the mix. He was right in the center of all this activity. John and Abigail were prominent members of Bostonian society, Massachusetts society, and were very much involved in keeping tabs on all of this stuff that was happening. Now, the passage of the Intolerable Acts in 1774 alarmed the colonists. And what happens is that in 1774, in Philadelphia, representatives from the colonies gather in what comes to be called the First Continental Congress. John Adams is selected from Massachusetts to go attend the First Continental Congress. He becomes one of the prominent figures in that Continental Congress. And what we see is the beginning of the first prolonged period of separation between John and Abigail. They are now going to be separated by distance. At first, about 300 miles between Boston and Philadelphia. So in 1774, the First Continental Congress is held. The First Continental Congress tries to find a peaceful solution to the problem. They write a petition, send it to the king. Nothing comes of that. So the following year, 1775, a Second Continental Congress is convened. This one now determined to figure out what are we going to do with the relationship with Britain. 1775 is significant in the story of the American Revolution because April 19th, 1775, up the road in Lexington and Concord, the first shots of the Revolutionary War are fired. The relationship between Britain and the colonies is torn. It is irreparable at this point. So the Second Continental Congress has some big things to deal with. What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with Britain? John is writing letters to Abigail, telling her what the discussions are, what the debates are in Congress. And Abigail is writing letters back to John saying, well, this is what's happening in Boston. The British troops are over here. There's battles going on over here. Abigail and John Quincy actually watch the Battle of Bunker Hill. They go up to the top of Penn's Hill near their farm and look out across the harbor and watch the battle being fought, seeing Charlestown in flames. She writes all of this and reports all of this to John in Philadelphia. And because of Abigail and her eyewitness accounts, he has better intelligence of what's going on in the war than many other members of Congress. He knows what's happening because his wife is telling him what's happening. Now, by the time we get to the spring of 1776, it's become apparent to most people that the relationship is fractured, the relationship between Britain and the colonies, and that something is going to have to be done. And there is talk that perhaps the colonies should completely separate from Britain, should become independent. John writes letters to Abigail telling her of these debates in Congress. And in March of 1776, she responds. And she responds in probably one of her most famous letters, the famous Remember the Ladies letter. In that letter, she starts off by telling John things that are going on. You know, so-and-so died, this house was burned down, people have looted this house, the farm is doing okay. And then she starts talking about politics, and she says, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited powers into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. Happy Valentine's Day. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. It's very forward-looking, isn't it? Abigail Adams is sometimes considered to be a proto-feminist, very much looking out for the rights of women. This is written in 1776. When do women in the United States get the right to vote? 1920. Took a little bit of time to eventually listen to what Abigail Adams was saying here. She goes on in other letters to say that women should get an education. They should be just as well educated as the men, because educated women raise educated children. And if we are establishing a new country, we must have an educated population to govern themselves. So she is very much a forceful voice in these letters to her husband. She is very much a guiding figure in some of the ideas that John Adams has. So this letter is written in March of 1776. John receives it while he's in Philadelphia. While he is in Philadelphia, he also makes the acquaintance and establishes a friendship with another figure who will loom large in the lives of the Adamses. One, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a young, wealthy Virginian who is elected to the Second Continental Congress. And he and Adams are among 5 men who are chosen to draft a document declaring the independence of the colonies. This committee of 5 included Jefferson, Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston from Connecticut, and Roger Sherman from Connecticut, Robert Livingston from New York. These 5 men were chosen by the Continental Congress to create a document stating the reasons why the colonies should be independent. Well, when the Committee of 5 meets to discuss their ideas, they kind of throw around some ideas, they brainstorm a little bit, and then they say, hey, Tom, you're going to write the thing. And Jefferson says, why me? And Adams has a list of reasons. He says, 1, you're more popular than I am, so people will accept it from you more than they will from me. Now, Adams was a brilliant man, but he realized his own failings. He was not a people person. He was kind of a grouch. He was prickly. He had no patience for people who he thought were dumber than he was, which was pretty much everybody. So he was not a people person. He was not a good intermingler like that. So Jefferson, more popular, you got to do that. Plus, you're from Virginia. And we should make it seem like Virginia is at the center of this. Virginia was the most populous colony at that time. And this last one must have killed Adams to admit, he says, you're a much better writer than I am. So Jefferson is tasked with writing the Declaration, what will become the Declaration of Independence. And he spends several weeks working on this draft. He comes up with the first draft and he hands it to Adams and Benjamin Franklin, who take out their red quills and start Xing out things and rearranging words and suggesting changes of the wording. And finally, in early July, a final copy of the Declaration of Independence is created. It's written up, presented to the Congress to vote on. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress unanimously votes to accept the Declaration of Independence. John writes home to Abigail saying, today, July 2nd, will be the great celebration day, the feast day marked by parades and fireworks and games. He was wrong. He was off by 2 days. Of course, the day we end up celebrating is July 4th, 1776, as the birth date of the United States. Here's Jefferson and Adams and Franklin working on the draft. Like many writers, there's piles of paper on the ground there. Here's the document we are familiar with, dated July 4th, 1776. So why is July 4th, 1776 the date we celebrate? rather than July 2nd. It's because that's the date that the final version of it was written down in nice, neat lettering, presented to the Congress for the President of the Congress to sign. What was his name? He's famous for his signature. John Hancock. John Hancock put his John Hancock on the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, and that's the day we celebrate. What does the Declaration of Independence say? Well, it basically says we have the right to our own government. King George III stinks because of these reasons. And the last part, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. We have declared our independence. Great. Now we just have to settle the matter on the battlefield. That takes a little bit of time. Well, after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, John comes home. He has a reunion with Abigail, but he also has some bad news. I'm home for now, but the Congress has decided that I should be one of the representatives of these new United States to go to Europe to try to drum up support for our revolution, to try to find monetary backing for this war against Britain and maybe some military assistance. So he's one of a series of diplomats sent to Europe to find allies for the United States. There's going to be a prolonged separation now. So John prepares to go to Europe, and he decides, you know what? I'm going to take my son, John Quincy, with me. John Quincy Adams at this time is 10 years old. His dad's, this is John Quincy over here. His dad says, you're coming with me. Now, John Quincy Adams was perhaps one of the most brilliant men to ever be president of the United States. He was remarkably intellectually gifted. By the time he was 10 years old, he spoke French better than his father did. And his dad said, well, I'm going to negotiate in Europe. The diplomatic language in Europe is French. My French isn't so good. I'm taking John Quincy with me. He'll be my translator. He'll be my secretary. So John Quincy Adams begins his career of public service as a boy of 10. And he would remain in public service until his death in 1848. That's an entirely different lecture, though, so we'll just kind of move on from that. So Adams goes to Europe. He goes to the Netherlands. He goes to France. He is working to find allies and friends for the United States. He ends up having some success. He, Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, all of these diplomats are there negotiating and bringing allies in. It's the French alliance, however, which proves to be the most important. 1778, France becomes an ally of the new United States, helps us wage war against Britain, helps us win that war against Britain. So that in 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed, granting America independence from Britain. We become an independent nation by the conclusion of the Revolutionary War. Britain acknowledges the independence of the United States in this treaty. So now Adams, John, is in Paris. He's been away from his wife for 5 years. He has his son with him. So what does he do? He writes her a letter and says, I'm going to be hanging out in Europe for a while, some diplomatic posts. Why don't you come join me? Grab Nabby and bring her with you. So Abigail and Nabby pack up their stuff, board a boat, and sail across the Atlantic Ocean to join John and John Quincy in Paris. Also in Paris at this time is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson and Adams are still good friends. They had successfully navigated the politics of the Revolutionary War. The elder Adams is kind of a mentor to Jefferson at this point. And when Abigail shows up with the rest of Adams's children, they form a nice, happy unit. Jefferson is a frequent visitor to the Adamses in their apartments in Paris. John is in Paris for a few years, or the Adamses are in Paris for a few years, before he goes to establish the first American embassy in London. So he moves his family from Paris to London. In Paris, Abigail was very happy. She was kind of afraid of going there. She didn't know what to expect when she was in Paris, but she gets there and she realizes it's Paris, right? There's Paris around that time period. Palaces, fine glittering clothing and food and opera and music. all of these things that were lacking in New England, frankly. Abigail goes to Paris and sees them and falls in love with them. She becomes a big fan of the opera and the theater. She has many friends in Paris. She manages in a house that has many servants, something unknown to her. When she was in Braintree, she was the one running the farm. She was the one keeping the books. She was the one conducting business. She had all of those responsibilities. Paris is something completely different. But from Paris, they moved to London. And she hated London. She hated London because it was cold, it was dreary, she didn't have any friends there, the theater wasn't as good, so she was unhappy. The Adamses are in Europe for 5 years as John has these various diplomatic posts. And in 1788, they decide to come back to the United States. The idea, or the thought, was that John was going to retire from his diplomatic life and go back to practicing law. But both John and Abigail decided that, you know what, we don't want to go back and live in those farmhouses back in that corner of Braintree. We want something a little bit more fitting for a retired diplomat, a retired member of the Continental Congress. So they had people in Massachusetts looking for available houses. As it turned out, there was a house in a different part of Braintree that both John and Abigail were familiar with. It was the Borland House. They had visited that house as children. It was a house that was really one of the largest houses in town, and it was available. It was unoccupied. Now, the Borland family happened to be loyalists, so they fled the country during the Revolutionary War. The house was largely empty. They heard the house was available, they had fond memories of the house, and they said, we'll buy it. They bought it sight unseen. And when they come back from Europe, they planned on moving into this new mansion house that John christened Peacefield. He thought it would be a peaceful respite from the world of troubles. Now, Peacefield, when the Adamses moved into it, was actually a relatively modest house. This is what it looks like today. If you imagine it, though, in 1788, it was just this front portion over here, up to this doorway over here. It was a relatively modest house, still the biggest house in town, but relatively small. It had 2 main rooms on the ground floor, 2 bedrooms above it. Not a big house. They get there to Peacefield and they're like, oh, this isn't anything at all like I remember it. It's much smaller. And Abigail in particular had a very hard time with it because she had gotten used to living in these grand apartments in Europe. Rooms with high ceilings, rooms like this room, right? And they move back here and they move into a small colonial house with low ceilings in rooms that were relatively dark without a lot of windows. And they're both kind of disappointed. But they set about to kind of make the house a home. They move in, they start painting the walls, kind of knocking some windows into the walls to allow more light in, that sort of thing. John thought he was done with politics. But 1788 is a very important year in American history. What happens in 1788? The first presidential election. The Constitution of the United States is ratified in that year, and we begin electing a federal government, creating a federal government. Who is elected President of the United States in 1788? George Washington. Who comes in second? John Adams. Adams is elected Vice President. Now, he thinks that this is a tremendous honor. I mean, he came in second place to George Washington. George Washington, whose birthday it was, or is coming up. Lincoln's was this past, yeah. So Washington's birthday is coming up. So, you know, this was a distinct honor for Adams to be chosen vice president. And here we see George Washington's inauguration in the nation's capital at that time, New York City. This is the balcony of Federal Hall. John Adams is somewhere in this scene over here. And this is John Adams as vice president of the United States. A tremendous honor. Except when you think about the duty of the vice president. Constitutionally, what does the vice president do? Nothing. The vice president sits around waiting for the president to be incapacitated or is called on to break tie votes in the Senate. Now, Adams was a man of incredible intellectual activity and constantly in motion. He thought the vice presidency was a significant honor until he actually took the office. And he realized that it was pretty much a useless office. And as he says, "My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived." Adams was largely miserable as Vice President of the United States. He had very little to do. George Washington didn't ask him for advice. Washington creates a cabinet to give him advice. The Senate had very little need of Adams to be there. They didn't have many tie votes to be broken, so he just sat around for 8 years. First in the national capital at New York, and then when the capital moved to Philadelphia, he sat around there. During this period, Abigail spent much of her time at home at Peacefield. She was fixing the house up, turning it into a functioning, efficient farm. John occasionally visited her, she occasionally visited him, but largely they were apart. They exchanged letters again, expressing their sorrow at their distance and their emotions for one another. Well, in 1796, George Washington decides, I don't want to be president anymore. I am not going to seek re-election or accept a re-election as president. 1796 is really the first wide open presidential election we have in American history. George Washington is off the stage. Who is going to be the next president? Well, as it turns out, John Adams wins the presidency in 1796 and is inaugurated in 1797. Now, when he becomes president, he is governing from Philadelphia. Philadelphia is still the national capital at this point. And Abigail comes down from Braintree, Quincy, to be the First Lady. Now, as First Lady, she was essentially John's most trusted advisor. He had a cabinet, he had a bureaucracy working for him, but when there were issues that needed to be decided, when he needed advice, he turned to his wife. She was very well informed of national affairs, so much so that some of her critics begin referring to her as Mrs. President. She had the ear of the president. He listened to what she said. So John is president from 1797 to 1801, and Abigail Adams was First Lady. Now, she was a different First Lady than Martha Washington. Martha Washington was very retiring, very quiet, very soft-spoken. Abigail was not. Abigail was very confident in her intelligence, in her intellectuality, and in her interpretation of events, and made sure that her opinion was heard by her husband. Whereas Martha Washington had no role in public affairs, Abigail Adams had tremendous influence over things that were happening. Well, she was largely unhappy as First Lady of the United States. It was very ceremonial. There were a lot of duties you had to undertake. But she stayed with her husband in Philadelphia for much of his presidency. However, around 1799, thereabouts, she gets sick and has to go back to Braintree to recuperate on the farm. So John is in Philadelphia by himself for a while. Now, while Abigail is recuperating at Peacefield, she's looking around the house and she says, I really am disappointed in this house. I really wish it were bigger. I really wish it were grander. So what does she decide to do? She decides to remodel. She decides to add on. John is away in Philadelphia and Abigail says, well, I'm the one who does the books here anyway. I'm the one who manages the place, so I'm going to expand the house. And she adds an east wing to the house. That becomes a large addition. The one thing Abigail really wanted was a big room, like one of those European rooms. So she has this room added to the house. It's called the long room. It's about 32 feet long, 32 feet wide, much higher ceilings than in the original part of the house. And it's furnished with furniture that the Adamses brought back from France. Louis XV furniture, in fact. Not Louis XV style. This is actually Louis XV furniture that they brought back from France. And so she decorates the house. But she realizes, you know what? If I'm building a room on the house for myself, I'd better build something for John. So on the second floor, above the long room, she creates a study. That will be John's room in the house. She gets the lower room, he gets that study. That is where his books end up, his collection of books, some 3,000 volumes that he owned. Writing desks go in there. That becomes the place where John will spend tremendous amounts of time. In 1800, we have an election year. It's the election of 1800. We also have a move in the national capital. The capital moves from Philadelphia further south to a newly laid out city called Washington, D.C. When Washington, D.C. is established as the national capital, there's a small construction boom there. A Congress building is built, a Capitol building, and a president's mansion is constructed. John, in October of 1800, moves down to Washington, D.C. to occupy the executive mansion, the president's house. Today we call it the White House. And Abigail joins him. She moves down to Washington, D.C. Now, the White House at that time was still unfinished. They were living in part of the building. In fact, there's the famous story that Abigail used to hang out her washing to dry in what eventually becomes the East Room. It was unfinished. There was no roof on it, so that's where I'm going to do the laundry. Abigail kind of liked Washington at that time. It was very much countryside. It's not like Washington today. It was rural. It was relatively peaceful. But she did have complaints. She said, though we're surrounded by woods, I can't find anybody who's willing to chop lumber for the White House, for the executive mansion. There were problems in living in this frontier. Another problem occurs, of course. Adams loses the election of 1800. He loses it to Thomas Jefferson. During the Washington administration, Adams and Jefferson, who had been such close friends, have a political falling out. They have different ideas of what the United States should be, and they become political rivals. And though Jefferson was Adams's vice president, the two men had different points of view, and Jefferson actively worked to undermine what Adams wanted to do. So their relationship collapses. It falls apart, as does the relationship between Abigail and Jefferson. They had once been close, now they are separated. So Adams loses his bid for re-election and decides, I'm retiring for good this time, I'm going back to Peacefield. He wanted to live the life of a middle-class farmer. So he retires to Peacefield into a political retirement. And there at Peacefield, he goes about, chopping down trees and putting shingles on the roof and planting crops and that sort of thing. And Abigail, for her part, begins designing a formal garden and really managing the estate and managing the household. She is raising two of their grandchildren. Nabby's kids have moved in with the parents. Eventually, Nabby does too. She makes a bad marriage selection and is abandoned by her husband and goes back home to live with her parents. So the house is full of activity. There are many generations living under one roof. All the grandkids come by at certain times. There's lots of stuff going on. And it seems like a relatively happy and fulfilled retirement. In 1817, Thomas Jefferson's daughter, Polly, dies. And Abigail is moved by that because in London and in Paris, they had grown quite close. So when she gets news that Thomas Jefferson's daughter had died, she writes Jefferson a nice letter offering her condolences. Part of that is in response to something Jefferson had done earlier. Nabby, John and Abigail's eldest child, dies of breast cancer in 1813. And Jefferson expressed his regrets at that. So Abigail writes back to Jefferson when his own daughter dies. And that begins a thawing of the relationship between Adams and Jefferson. Soon, John and Tom are writing letters back and forth to one another. And in fact, from this point to the end of their lives, they would write some 320-something letters back and forth, patching up their relationship, kind of saying, it was really stupid for us to fight over politics when we had been such good friends. And look what we did. Look what we created as part of this revolution, as part of this founding generation. Look at the country we've established. So Abigail really is the first to try to mend that relationship with Thomas Jefferson. Yet Abigail won't be on the scene for very much longer, because in 1818, she catches typhoid and slowly succumbs to the disease. She dies on October 28th, 1818, a couple of days shy of her birthday. She dies on this bed in what is called the president's bedroom. And her last words to John, who is sitting by her side, "Do not grieve, my friend, my dearest friend. I am ready to go. And John, it will not be long." Abigail dies in October of 1818. John is deeply, deeply hurt by this. He is crushed by the death of his companion. They had been married for 58 years or something like that. My math is wrong. But they had been married for a long time. They had created this partnership, this friendship, this romance that withstood all of this turmoil, separation, distance, revolution, death of children, all of that. They had withstood that and been by each other's sides the whole time. John was so emotional about the loss of Abigail that he refused to sleep in this room ever again. For the next 8 years of his life, he slept on a pull-out bed in his study on the other side of the house. He refused to go and sleep in the bed that he had shared with his beloved Abigail. And it was actually in that study that Abigail had built for John Adams that he ends up dying. Now, John Adams dies on July 4th, 1826. July 4th, 1826 is a significant date. One, it's the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The United States has reached 50 years of age. It's also the date on which John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, two of the men most responsible for that document, die within hours of each other. Really one of the remarkable historical coincidences. Now, Jefferson died down in Monticello, Virginia. He had been sick for some time, and he had been in and out of consciousness. And every time he awoke, he would ask those around him, "Is it the 4th?" And they would say, "No, it's not the 4th." And he would close his eyes. Finally, early on the morning of July 4th, he wakes up, opens his eyes, says, "Is it the 4th?" And he's told, yes, it is the 4th. He closes his eyes and expires. Meanwhile, in Quincy, at Peacefield, Adams wakes up on the morning of July 4th full of energy and life. He's 91 years old, but he's doing fairly well for someone his age. He is relatively healthy. He's going blind, though. He has lost most of his sight. That morning, he is sitting at the window of his study, and he watches the parade go by his house as people in Quincy go to cheer the former president. He gives a short declaration to them. He says, "Long live liberty," something along those lines. And then he goes back into his study, closes the window, and he's sitting in his favorite wing chair in one of the corners of the study. One of his granddaughters or nieces is sitting there reading to him. He is peacefully listening when he suddenly suffers a massive stroke, falls to the ground. He is lifted onto the cot that's in that room, and he lays there, kind of mumbling and slurring his words. Somebody leans close over him, and he says, with his last breath, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died hours earlier. But it's remarkable to think that one of the last thoughts that John Adams had was of this once friend who became a political rival, who then became a friend through the machinations, through the work of Abigail. Repairing that relationship was one of the greatest things that Abigail does for John in his later life. So John Adams, Thomas Jefferson die on July 4th, 1826. And John is buried next to his wife in the Hancock Cemetery in downtown Quincy. They lay side by side there in the cemetery until the Church of the Presidents is constructed. I want to say in the 1830s, but I could be wrong on the date then it was constructed. And John and Abigail are moved into the crypt side by side where they rest for eternity. So that is the story of the relationship between John and Abigail Adams, and really the story of the birth of the United States. Thank you.